we want to understand the roots of US foreign policy in the Middle East or anywhere, a useful starting point is World War II, when the world order really changed a whole lot. And in fact, we have a rich declassified record to draw on. And there's a very good book called Imperial Brains Trust by two guys called Shoup and Minter. That's like shop, but with a U in it, and Minter, which is from the 1970s. What was uncovered by Lawrence Shoup and Minter in Imperial Brains Trust was the record of planning during World War II by people from the business think tank in the US, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the State Department, and they got together and they formed a War and Peace Studies project, and they were planning for the post-war world, and the key concept was the Grand Area. And the Grand Area was the territory which should be taken under control by the United States, quotes, in a world in which it proposes to hold unquestioned power. And so one of the directors of the Council on Foreign Relations described the Grand Area as the area, quotes, strategically necessary for world control. At first, they thought that Nazi Germany was going to win the war in Europe, so their planning was for the non-German area. Later on, it became clear Germany was going to fail, and so their ambitions expanded. So, you know, people say in relation to the Middle East, well, the way to get the US or Britain or the West or whatever to stop interfering so much in the Middle East is to move away from dependence on fossil fuels and oil from the Middle East. I think there's a million good reasons to reduce dependence on fossil fuels. A lot of reasons. However, if the US and Britain went 100% solar tomorrow, they would still be 100% committed to controlling the Middle East. Because it isn't about consumption of oil, though that's an increasing factor. It's about power and control. So, for example, Zbigniew Brzezinski, just after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, said, restating something that planners had been saying since the Second World War, that control of Middle Eastern energy resources gives the US indirect but politically critical leverage on the European and Asian economies that are also dependent on energy exports from the region. Because the United States' biggest enemies in the world are the European economy, which has been based on Germany, and the Asian economy, which used to be centered around Japan. And those are the real economic and industrial rivals of the United States, you know, Europe and Asia. And by controlling the oil upon which they depend, the US has what George Kennan, a key US planner in the 1940s, called veto power over those economies, and therefore power over their political development as well. In 1991, the US and UK didn't go to Baghdad, as everyone knows, because what they were anticipating, and there's plenty of documentary record about this, was that Saddam Hussein would be deposed by another general. Same old system instituted by Britain would be there, you know, Sunni minority control in the whole country, except with a different face at the top. Things didn't quite work out the way that they wanted. 2003, basically the same thing. I've written two books about this, War Plan Iraq and Regime Unchanged. If you go back to the Financial Times report on the 48-hour ultimatum, you know, Saddam Hussein and your sons get out. Financial Times story on that was, this is not really an ultimatum for Saddam Hussein to leave. This is a signal to the generals, you've got that much amount of time to get rid of this guy. And what the US and UK were looking for in Iraq, there's a ton of evidence, if you want to go into it we can talk about it, was not regime change, but leadership change. Saddam Hussein and his entourage out, and basically the same system of control, except it didn't work out that way. So the US is not going to permit real democracy or significant sovereignty in Iraq, but it's struggling to find some way of controlling it through some kind of client regime, which they haven't quite created a dependable client regime there.
I want to talk briefly, what does very, very well, in quotes, look like in Iraq today? The first thing, I think the most important statistic that we have to acknowledge is how many Iraqis have died as a result of the US invasion and occupation. And There's been some debate about that number. There's even a news story that came out today that the Baghdad morgue is reporting that at least 50,000. But I like to cite, that's just the Baghdad morgue. That's the main morgue in Baghdad, but that's one morgue in a country of 25 million people. And I like to cite the study that was published in the Lancet survey where they did an aggregate study on the ground in Iraq and found 98,000 dead. And that was published on October 29, 2004. And I like to point out that that number is far too low for three main reasons. One, it's grossly out of date. It's over a year and a half out of date. Two, they didn't include areas of major combat operations because they didn't want to skew the survey, so they didn't include the Fallujahs and the Najafs. And three, to conduct a study like this, you have to have a baseline, and so their baseline for this study obviously had to be pre-invasion, and it was the last 17 months of the sanctions. The sanctions where, of course, over 1 million Iraqis at least were killed by malnutrition, disease, lack of medicines, things like this. So that was the baseline. And since that report was published, just this last spring, Les Roberts, one of the co-authors, said the argument, we shouldn't be talking in the tens of thousands about how many Iraqis have been killed. We need to be talking, is it 100, 200, or 300,000? And he has said even since then that it may well be even over 300,000. And especially if we look at how events have gone in the last 6 months to a year in Iraq, the figure of 250,000 or maybe even 300,000 starts to look a bit more realistic. And then on top of that, we have roughly, when we look in wars, if you look at the number of dead, the number of wounded is going to be exponentially higher than that. So we're talking, as far as wounded Iraqis, at least 5 times that number have been wounded as well. And with U.S. soldiers, now we're well over 2,500. I think I just read a news piece this morning that at least 16 were killed in the last week. And since technology has advanced so much that less soldiers are dying, so more are being wounded and kept alive, but they're in pretty bad shape. And we can say that 10 times that number of soldiers have been wounded. And when we say wounded, we don't mean a broken arm or stitches. We mean they're being kept alive by machines, or they're on permanent they have permanent disability for the rest of their lives. The security situation in Baghdad is such that my main interpreter there really can't leave his house much anymore. I've been in touch with him real regularly. Especially lately, and there's been much fighting in his neighborhood, and his front door's even been shot up, and his kids have had some of their friends that were killed in a bomb at a market. There's death squads roaming the city. Every morning in Baghdad, people wake up and hope that there aren't bodies in their streets. In fact, recently, two different people that I know in Baghdad have said that now they just find heads in the streets. This is life in Baghdad, in liberated Iraq today. To talk about the infrastructure briefly, electricity, the average home in Iraq now has 3 hours of electricity per day. On infrastructure, we can say, based on facts, hard evidence from the ground, that on all levels, basic infrastructure is far worse now than it was even during Saddam Hussein and the sanctions. Everyone in this room, I'm sure most people here are aware of how bad and how devastating the sanctions were. Well, that's a big thing to say, that the infrastructure is far worse now than it was during the sanctions. Electricity, water, we have potable water availability problems in even the capital city, where oftentimes people turn on their taps and nothing comes out. If it does, you better boil it. There's cholera outbreaks even in the capital city. Rampant waterborne diseases, illnesses from that.